Merry Christmas, shipmates, and welcome back to another episode of On the Wind. I'm normally your host, Andy Schell. Today, we've got Emma Garshagen guest hosting the show. I am particularly excited about this episode. She interviewed Elliot Rappaport. I have not heard it yet, so I'll be listening to it just like you will be as a fan. But Elliot wrote the book called Reading the Glass, which Emma actually got for me as a Christmas present last year. And it's the best book I've read on sailing in general and weather specifically in a very long time. Elliot, I'll let Emma explain who Elliot was, but he has a way of writing that is just really enthralling to read. And also he explains things in a really easy to understand manner. He explains weather and climate and does so through all these sea stories that he has from over the years. It's a wonderful, wonderful book, and I'm really excited to hear Emma's interview with Elliot. So if you haven't read the book, definitely check it out. Maybe a late Christmas present for yourself this year. All right, not much happening at 59 North. We've been closed for the holidays. I'm recording this the week before it comes out because we'll be off the grid. My dad and sister are coming to Sweden, so Axel's very excited for that. And then we'll be heading to Portugal to start the season. So it'll be a quick break, and then we'll be back sailing. We've still got some openings next year on both boats and things to look forward to. We are going to be launching the new website and Eastbjorn's 2025 calendar in the first week of January. So look for that. When Falcon sets sail on January 6th, the new website will be up and running with new tracking maps, new blogs from the boats coming at sea, and just an updated refresh on the look and feel of the website. And you'll be able to book Eastbjorn's passages in 2025. So looking forward to that. We'll see y'all next year. Until then, hold fast.
On the Wind is presented by Pelagic Autopilots. Do you need a reliable autopilot that you can count on? Whether crossing an ocean or enjoying a day sail in your local waters, Pelagic Autopilot is for you. It's manufactured by Scanmar International, where the monitor wind vane has been made for over 4 decades. They know what it takes to make a robust and sturdy equipment that can survive the harsh marine environment. 59 North has a Pelagic unit on our FAR 65 Falcon. While offshore, we often use the autopilot during dinner time so everyone can be hands-free to enjoy the meal. I was really impressed by the remote control, which made it easy for the skipper to adjust our course without having to climb back to the helm and potentially get wet. Eastbjorn is in Sweden getting a makeover this winter and will be getting a new Pelagic unit as well. Pelagic's testing grounds are the Pacific coastal races, and their philosophy is to provide simple, self-contained products that require no connection to proprietary data networks, one of the biggest advantages to the robust and redundant systems that we have aboard Eastbjorn and Falcon. The Pelagic Autopilot uses the latest sensor and computer technologies to hold a course in a variety of conditions for just about any tiller or wheel-steered vessel. Go to pelagicautopilots.com to learn more and spec your own system. That's pelagicautopilots.com. On the Wind is presented by Dive Blue, creators of battery-powered tankless diving systems for convenient diving in shallow water. Blue's Nomad product allows you to dive up to 30 feet for about 1 hour per battery. The unit floats on the surface, which connects the diver using a hose and a smart reg that turns the pump on when you inhale and off when you exhale. This all fits neatly into a carry-on size backpack. I can attest that it is carry-on sized. I have flown with one to and from the boats. And it's similar to the scuba systems of old, but without the weight complexity and the noise and the smell of an engine needed to run it. We have a Nomad system on board Falcon for when we arrive into a place like Bermuda and want to clean the bottom, inspect the propeller, and the rudder prop anodes and through hulls. And not having to free dive means the whole inspection can be much, much more thorough. As someone who is pretty bad at free diving myself, I appreciate having this option. I'm excited to also use the system to go look around at reefs and wildlife while we're living on the boat on anchor. Having the benefits of a scuba setup without needing lots of equipment and compressors is efficient and therefore more fun. Head on over to diveblue.com to check out the various setups that they offer. That's DIVEBLU3.com. Thanks again to Dive Blue for supporting this season of the podcast. Hey, On the Wind listeners, it's Emma. I'm so happy to be back hosting this episode with Elliot Rappaport, a friend of mine who was my captain on the Robert C. Seamans when I was a student with SEA, Sea Education Association. And he recently wrote this wonderful book called Reading the Glass that I highly recommend. And before we get into the interview, I'm going to read a short little snippet of it just to give you a sense of his writing and his wonderful storytelling. So here it is. Sailors rarely spend time debating in situations like this. I take the wheel as he leads the watch forward to take in sail, individuals vanishing to their preordained stations in the blackness, lines with exotic names that they must now find in the dark, the halyard coils prepared specially to avoid the potential disaster of fouling. There is shouted communication, a flurry of activity, and just as the work concludes, an abrupt wall of wind-driven rain heeling the ship over another 7 or 8 degrees, even with half of her canvas now safely furled. I steer to keep the wind astern, aware of a sudden flattening of the sea around us, pounded down by the torrent and a heavy draft of cold air. Small tempests of spray spin up from broken wave tops. Somebody asks me how hard I think it is blowing, and I am not sure, though afterwards we'll see that the anemometer has recorded a peak gust of 52 knots, a bit more than double what we'd started with. As the watch comes aft, there is another flash of lightning, the clap of thunder just above us like an artillery shell. 15 minutes into the maelstrom, the wind abates, and stars reemerge as the squall line tails away to leeward. A broken coffee mug rolls about disconsolately in the scuppers with some other random debris. My glasses are useless, and I have water trickling down the neck of my raincoat and onto my t-shirt. The watch regroups and begins to plan for the substantial task of setting sail again. They will do this with the oncoming team in an hour, shaking out wet gear while forks of lightning play dramatically on the horizon. You're listening to On the Wind, the podcast about sailing. I'm your host, Emma Garshagen. Elliot Rappaport has been a captain of sailing ships for the past 3 decades. He currently is a faculty member at Maine Maritime Academy, where he lives nearby with his wife and their dog. Elliot was my captain aboard SEA's Robert C. Seamans in New Zealand during a semester trip, and he recently published a fantastic book about weather and life at sea that should be part of everyone's ship's library. It is called Reading the Glass. Especially because we didn't, get ourselves in the same room today. I like to start, if you can describe where you're sitting, like the room, what the room you're in looks like, and then where you're physically located today.
Yeah, sure. I'm at my house in Surrey, Maine, which is a suburb of Blue Hill, kind of up in the Ellsworth Bar Harbor area. And it's actually a house that I built some time ago, kind of when I was spending a lot of time at sea. So a fairly small place, but for the last several years, I've been mostly ashore teaching at Maine Maritime Academy, and it's actually fairly convenient to there. So it's worked out well. So small house filled with books and the sort of bric-a-brac that you pick up over the course of a sailing and boating career, but just enough room for 2 people.
Yeah, and you live there with your wife and a dog, I think.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, fun. And when did you build the house? Like, what was going on in your life when you did that?
I built it. I was in the early 90s, and as I said, I was spending, at that point, spending a good deal of time at sea, but just sort of needed a place to keep my things and to live, when I wasn't at sea. That wasn't my parents' house, and they've actually been almost since the beginning of that process. There've been 2 of us here, but it's wound up being a great sort of base camp and home for kind of a lifestyle that's involved a lot of coming and going, but we've been able to come back to here pretty consistently over the years.
That's great. Yeah.
We've got just about every animal that Maine can offer wanders through the yard at least once a
Really?
day. So it's
Cool.
never dull to look out the windows.
Are you sort of in the woods or what's the like?
We're at the edge of the woods. We're on a coastal road, sort of a tertiary coastal road that runs along one of the Morgan Bay, which was an upper bay of Blue Hill Bay. So we've got a view out to the east over Mount Desert.
Cool.
And then behind us is a fairly sizable patch of woods. So there's a lot of, there's bear and moose, and, there's actually, bobcats and stuff like that. So it's a really interesting, coastal woodland environment, overgrown pasture and wetlands and things like that. So yeah, very, very diverse as far as wildlife and plants and stuff are concerned.
That sounds beautiful. And do you have or ever keep your own boat? Do you ever have a small boat where you're living?
No, I've up till now I've so far managed to resist owning my own boat. I have a fleet of kayaks, but all the boats that I've owned over the year have been made of plastic and small ones to put on top of a car. So
Nice.
I think the sailing career has sort of made me immune to the desire to own my own boat. Well, I'm starting to rethink that now at this late date.
Yeah, I mean, living ashore more, I feel like
Exactly.
maybe gives you a little more of a it'd be nice to have a. I get that. Well, cool. Well, I feel very lucky to have sailed with you and now get to talk to you. However many years, 5 years later, I think. I think my program was in the March of 2018 in New Zealand.
Okay. Yep.
It was S277, which for listeners is SEA, Sea Education Association's way of labeling which trip is which. So we were on the Robert C. Seaman's. I think the program was called Global Ocean, and we sailed down the east coast of New Zealand, stopping along the way. And the anthropologist Jeff Westcott would take us ashore and introduce us to different people, and we did an anthropology class with him. And then the chief scientist was also named Jeff. No, that can't be true.
We did have a Jeff. Yeah, Chuck.
We had Chuck. Yeah, we had Chuck on maybe his last voyage of his SEA career. So yeah, I and that trip, which in my memory, weather wise, was not particularly remarkable. We didn't have any. I think there was one night where the students weren't allowed on deck, but mostly I remember floating around a lot, and it was relatively calm. And but it was a life-changing, career-changing trip for me. It was probably sort of it definitely set me on a course of more of a professional sailing and going to sea sort of life, which I know it does for a lot of people. And it was the first time I'd sailed, with professional mariners, like with you, and Allison Taylor was the chief mate, and it was really it was the first time that I was like, oh, people keep doing this, this sailing thing that had been small boats on the Hudson River for me growing up. Suddenly became a thing that could continue into a career. So I'm curious about when and how you realized that a maritime career was possible for you.
I grew up in southern New England on Cape Cod, and kind of similarly, my family kind of had a recreational sailing habit in them, so. But it was kind of during, late in high school and early in college, and I began to be aware, just because of the other stuff that was going on around there, that that it could be a career, or at least more than just something that you kind of did, recreationally on weekends. And actually had a couple of experiences at Maine. I never really liked sailing with my family that much. It was something that we kind of, it was our mandatory family fun thing. And I don't think either my brother or I really ever enjoyed it that much. But, it was actually, I discovered that, it wasn't really being on the water that I didn't like. It was like being on the water with my family. And I actually really enjoyed, being around, being on the water and being around boats. And so, there was, Woods Hole Oceanographic. There was a bunch of, there was a very active boat building community. So there was a, very active working waterfront there. And, I got a few summer jobs directed towards that. I wasn't really ready to. I had some friends who went to Massachusetts Maritime Academy, but at that point, I wasn't really ready, partly out of ignorance, I think, to commit to a professional career at sea at that point. But I sort of backed into it. Like you, I did a program while I was in college with the Sea Education Association. And again, that just, like you, kind of exposed me to, the whole world of traditional sailing ships and also oceanography. And, that organization is kind of it's a fairly unique nexus between those two branches of the industry. Although, historically, there's a lot of oceanography that's been done from sailing ships, certainly over the years. So I just, through a few contacts I made there, that really pulled me into the professional sailing industry, and also the parts of it that were connected to education. And sort of through those same contacts, I was at that point came up to Maine. It was just sort of, a couple people told me that, this was a place where things were really happening. If you're interested in traditional sail, if you're interested in boat building, and so I sort of ran away from home, moved up to Maine, and that's kind of where I've been ever since.
Did you really, was it like running away from home? What was that like?
Well, there was no acrimony, but it was more like, just, it's like you do, you get pulled into, if you're lucky, you find something you're really fascinated with doing, and you find a place where you can do it. Then suddenly you're, someplace you've gone and been doing it for a long time.
Yeah. And was that a big leap for you to like go from where you were in Cape Cod up to Maine? Did that feel big at the time?
Not really. No, I mean, it wasn't, it was still coastal New England. So there was a lot of stuff that was, familiar, although the landscape, the coastal landscape in Maine is certainly much more extensive. And, I think at that point, a lot of the traditional skills connected with waterfront economies were, still much more active. So,
yeah. And you went, up and sailed on the Windjammers. Was that what you did?
Yeah, I did. That was, I got a job in the Windjammer fleet, with one of the vessel that, one of the very well established vessels, one of the older operations up there. And that was just, that whole part of the industry is just this great, stored bank of knowledge and skill and vessels, certainly unique on this side of the Atlantic. I mean, there are other parts of the world where that sort of thing functions. I know in the Netherlands, there's maybe something similar, but yeah, certainly unique in the U.S. And just this whole community, this whole fleet of ships, and the preserved skills to sail them, and the knowledge to build them and look after them and things like that. So, just sort of came up and got involved with that, and then sort of one thing led to another, and something I've never really from there, not something I ever really set aside.
Yeah. And when was the first time you went to sea? Was that with SEA or before?
That was my first sort of long experience sailing offshore. I'd spent sort of previously in summers, I'd spent some time working. We had a family friend who had a small a towboat operation, and I worked for them for a summer, and had done some small, like yacht delivery and stuff and things like that. But in a sustained way, sort of in an ocean crossing way. My experience at Sea Education Association was my first involvement with that.
Do you have like moments from that you still remember or think about? Was there any time on that trip that was really notable, like where you were like, oh, I'm going to keep doing this, or I want more of this?
No, I can't really think back to, like a sort of watershed moment. I think it was just, and it's all, honestly, at this point, it's kind of all run together, but it was just the combination of experiences and meeting the other people there who had made careers of it. And, the whole environment of working on a ship at sea, I sort of joke around about, it's a great occupation if you've got a short attention span, and that's not really true. Certainly at Maine Maritime Academy, we spend a lot of time trying to train people on how to pay attention. But it is a great place if you're interested in a lot of different things. We can't settle on being interested in just one thing. Just anybody who's in the I think marine industry will agree, right? There's really no end of things that you need to figure out and pay attention to. So.
Yeah. Let's talk a little more about that because I think I think a lot of people who like listen to this show are sailors, but the majority of them, I'm assuming, are on small boats or on recreational sailboats, and I think it translates. Like on a small sailboat, you become an electrician and a mechanic, and you learn all the pieces as you go, but on a large traditional sailing ship, the beast is a bit different, but there still is no end to all the things you can do. So, yeah, can you talk a little more about that, like how that excited you and how you sort of found your path in it? Because you could have become an engineer, you could have become a steward or something.
Yeah, and I guess I have sailed as an engineer briefly, but certainly. On small vessels, and even if the vessel's of a pretty good size, I think you do need to be a generalist, and certainly the more you know about the different stuff that's going on, the better equipped. Whether you're dealing with it directly or you're working with the people who have it as their primary responsibility, or if you're overseeing work on the ship, and like I said, it was that I was interested in the construction aspect of it. I've always been interested in engineering, the whole, the management, just a good, vessel that's got a good community aboard, a good working community aboard, that sort of just the task or the skill of having a group of people working together, on a project, or, you're operating a complex system, right? Things are never the same. Really from one day to the next, just the process of maintaining and working together with a team at sea has always been really interesting to me.
Yeah, and especially as the captain, which is how you spent a lot of your career as the captain of a big ship, you're working with the engineers, you're working with the scientists on a lot of these boats, you're working with everyone, and they are in charge of their little section, but you have to sort of keep the whole machine moving. Do you feel like there's like what have you found is like one of the keys to having a good shipboard environment, to like having a good crew?
I think, and having an environment that encourages people to share information, that's really at the heart of, like I said, at Maritime Academy, it's like on the training side, it's a little bit of a new paradigm, and by that, new, several decades old by now, but the idea of, any kind of a team in a complicated situation, needs to be flexible. There needs to be some kind of an established hierarchy, but I think there also really needs to be, everybody needs to have a clear enough idea of what the goal is so that they can share information effectively. If they see something you can't, there's nobody who's well enough informed to see the whole picture. So you spend a lot of time, making sure that people understand that. And the more senior you are in the picture, you need to be very conscientious about trying to share information in a systematic way. And then, if you're more junior, you need to be able to take that information up. You need to be able to pay attention, but you also need to understand that you're a franchised part of the process, and it's also your responsibility to share what you know and what you see. And so I guess in terms of, like, from a leadership standpoint, it's just keeping that in mind and making sure that you're not going ahead with the assumption that everybody knows what's going on, or just kind of putting it on people to expect to figure it out for themselves. I mean, that's it's kind of a sliding scale, but that's kind of at the center of it. Yeah,
I think that's that's sort of a leadership concept that can span way outside of sailing. But if you as the captain are sort of holding all your cards close and not telling people about the weather forecast because you're the one looking at it in the aft cabin, then you're not giving them the ability to then inform you when they notice the horizon changing or something like that. And I think that's a hard skill to learn. Do you feel like you had a process of learning it, or like, did you have a moment where you maybe didn't do that and wished you had? And like, what was your arc of sort of learning to have that flow of information?
Yeah, I think it's like learning anything. I think if you're lucky, you get to work with people who, are good role models, and you sort of think about it. You can't at the moment really think about like, what it is that was positive or negative about experience. But looking back, you can sort of recognize people that, right, you realize that they were good at sort of empowering the people that were working for them. And there's a way of getting the most out of people that involves, giving them plenty to do, and making sure that, because you wind up, I feel like spent a lot of time feeling like I was, by no means the most skilled person on the ship, and that's also, understanding you've got very good people on your team, and making sure they understand that's appreciated. Allowing them to do the most that they can. So,
did you have someone who did that for you that you feel like you learned that from? Like, did you have a captain who did that or didn't and taught you it that way?
No, like I said, I've been pretty lucky. I've had a few, been able to work with some people who are really, really good. There's somebody named, there's a captain named Andy Chase, who was pretty well known in the industry, and he recently retired from Maine Maritime Academy also. And, but he's somebody who has been, sort of pick one individual as kind of somebody who's been a mentor on and off throughout my own career. I worked for him when MMA, Maine Maritime Academy, has a sail training vessel called the Bowden. She's an old schooner. It's basically a fishing schooner, but she was built for work in the Arctic. And I went to work for him when they got that vessel to help him start a sail training program, and wound up running the boat myself fairly shortly after that. But he's sort of to name one person, who's been somebody I feel like I've been fortunate to learn from. And there've been a number of people like that kind of throughout the industry and in different parts of it, on the construction side, vessels of different types, and not just specifically in the marine industry, but just people that you work with. There are several people in the SEA organization who had really effective leadership and communication skills, and I felt like we're really effective at managing groups of people. When you had a room, when clearly everybody meant well, but there wasn't necessarily agreement on how something would proceed, and there were a few people there that were very skilled at making the most out of a situation like that, and dealing when things were when stuff was happening that was really important, dealing with emergent situations.
Yeah, and I feel like people who have sailed with larger crews, generally that's often traditional sailboats now, or sail training vessels. I think the way that you have to communicate has to become really effective, because you might need to communicate something really important in a short period of time, if some situation at sea is emerging and things just need to start happening to deal with it. And I think it's helped me be a more direct communicator. I think I've just noticed over the years, like having an easier time just telling someone, in a more clear way than I think I could have before I started sailing. I think leadership and weather and navigation and all these pieces of what it means to like maybe be a good captain or be a good seafarer. Those are all things that you have been doing for a long time and learning how to do, but not like as you learn how to do them, you are also always teaching them. Like you wrote this book that is incredibly instructive about weather, but also makes it interesting, like any good lesson, should. And you taught a leadership course at SEA when I was there. And I'm curious, like why you think the teaching part of it is important to you, because you could go to sea and never do teaching in the sort of more formalized way that you do.
Yeah, that's, I think to start with, I think one of the things that's interesting about the maritime profession, maybe a lot of sort of like active, what you think of as sort of hands-on workplaces, is that it's very much an on-the-job training environment. There's really no place, I think there are all sorts of things that are like this, but there's no real place that you can go and learn everything that you need to know, but on the ship itself. And so, it's one of those professions where, most mariners, like being able to teach, being able to explain things, is, I think, a really important part of the mariner's skill set. So, whereas maybe some of us find ourselves, I'm going to go work at a maritime academy, but it is kind of interesting, like a place like Maine Maritime Academy, the way that most of their teaching faculty are people who are, either in the midst of or have moved on from active shipping careers, and both as bridge officers and engineers. But a lot of them, they just sort of walk off the ship and come to teach, there's not a highly engineered sort of onboarding process for this, or onboarding system for this process. But what's really astounding is, a lot of those people just sort of walk in the door and start teaching, and do it very effectively. And so I think, what that really means is that, the maritime industry is a place where there's just so much training that gets done, just sort of hour to hour on the job. So I think everybody who's good at the job, is really already has already given quite a bit of thought to teaching. I think maybe whether they know that or not.
Right. Whether they, because you came up and worked on sail training vessels, which have the, education is in the mission statement, but that's true that happens anyway, on other ships. What do you like about teaching?
I think, I'm just very interested in stuff. I think I've always found it, I feel like I've always had the habit of trying to, explain things to myself, and, sort of thinking about, that's probably kind of how I wound up with a book, which is, it's always sort of running through explanations for things and trying to, and I think to me, it's just sort of another part of, like taking stuff apart to find out how that works. And, you can take apart an engine, but just also to think about, taking apart an idea or a concept or something even. So, I feel like it's just always been, I've always run through explanations kind of in my head for stuff. So I think,
then they start to come out over time.
right. And so teaching just, was an interesting application for that.
Yeah, I understand that. I think, I think I often learn the thing best myself when I have to go explain it to someone else. And that's like a very common, sort of learning style. But yeah, I also think go ahead.
I was going to say, it also exposes you to different ways of understanding stuff. You sort of need to think not just about how you understand stuff, but you start to realize, different. I mean, you kind of learn from the people that you're teaching, because you realize people have different ways of viewing things. And so
certainly, and then that probably also all ties right back into leading a crew and having a crew of students and ship scientists and engineers and everyone to communicate effectively with. They're all going to be like understanding what you're saying in different ways. So I'm sure the teaching sort of feeds back into being an effective captain. It feeds back into the teaching, or maybe they're not even that separate. Something this was making me think about as well is like the skill of observation. Because I think, like, I don't know what you just said, I'm interested in stuff, which is like a great, concise way to say that, like, you're curious about your environment and you want to know how it works. And I think part of that, is observation with, weather, navigation and science and sailing. You have to be paying attention all the time. Is that something you feel like you've always done? Like as a kid, were you curious about, the stuff you found in your backyard, or were you a kid who was like taking a radio apart and trying to put it back together, or what were you like then?
Yeah, I guess so. I spent a fair amount of time like paying attention to not necessarily paying attention to the stuff that people were telling me I should be paying attention to. Like I wasn't, was not a great student, certainly, at least to begin with. But I guess, I was always sort of naturally curious. I read a lot of books and did spend quite a bit of time, maybe without realizing, but I did spend a lot of time sort of thinking about things sometimes I'll, say somebody will say, well, how do you know that? And I was just like, I don't know. I got interested in it, and, I learned about it, or I just,
Mm.
I heard this and I retained it. So,
Yeah. Were you sort of like, are you someone who hears an interesting thing and then like goes and tries to find out everything you can about it? Like, are you sort of like a researcher in that way?
uh, yeah, maybe not always in a methodical way, although certainly I've been like, writing a book will certainly train you to be more, a little bit more systematic with your research. Um, and, but yeah, I've always, you get attracted with something, and, maybe not in a manic way, but that's one of the things, like, weather, for example, that's something that you can just sort of continue to learn about. And that's, partly because the system itself is so complicated, and the tools are always expanding, and so you never stop seeing stuff that you haven't seen before.
Yeah,
Certainly on a ship, yeah, it's so much part of your day to day that.
Yeah. Yeah, and let's talk about weather in the book a little bit, because I think like it started with the weather lesson plan. Like the book started with all these pieces of like, okay, how do you understand weather and the global weather system, and how it applies to you. But then I think what like makes the book so incredible is that you then wove all this story into it to like make the weather relevant to more people than sailors probably, or than people who are already inherently interested in and paying attention to weather. So how did those two things come together? Like, how did you take your hard sort of science weather explanations and tie them into stories from your time at sea?
Yeah, I mean, it did start off, like you say, the book, at least the technical parts of the book really did emerge out of a series of stuff, that some of it was lessons, some of it, I don't know if you remember from your own time, like in the SEA classroom, or whether you read it or not, but, I had done some writing because I felt like, because there weren't a lot of really good sort of non-technical, like, thorough but non-technical sources on weather. There are a lot of good textbooks, but just in terms of like basic, thorough, like qualitative explanations of how weather worked. And so I had done some sort of writing and putting together material.
Yeah, you kind of had your own little textbook, right? Was that?
Yeah, or chapters. It wasn't really up to the level of being a textbook, but there are a couple of people had suggested, well, gee, this might be a book. And then, what I found from there is that there wasn't really, the part of it that when I started speaking to people kind of in the book world, the part of it they were most interested in was the sailing aspect. And that wasn't really something that I hadn't really thought about that as being part of the story. And I think part of it is you're wrapped up in the day to day of what you do. And so I think it was, recognizing that was like to a broader audience, that was going to be a more interesting part of the narrative. In fact, probably, would be the narrative. If you were going to create something that more than just a handful of people wanted to read, you could identify the parts of the sailing process that would be interesting. And that, that wasn't when I started the project, I kind of had to come across that, but it wound up being an effective tool without, there isn't really anything in the book, at least from a personal standpoint. It's not a story of some epic voyage or weather event. But, I think one of the things that I felt like did work pretty well was that it does kind of stitch together the day to day, that's sort of, even if you're not dealing with some kind of an acute situation, weather is just sort of always this background element.
Which
time at sea.
Yeah. Which I think, like, as a person who has been to sea and then comes back and people ask you about it, they're always asking for the tallest wave or the most wind or the sea story. And as we know, like, that's usually not, and hopefully that's not what happened. Hopefully you don't have that story.
Lucky, right? Yeah. Exactly. If you're lucky, you don't have that story.
Yeah. If you're lucky, it's actually quite boring. And and so I think that's what was. I mean, there were some wonderful scenes you painted of more dramatic weather, but also just the sort of regular, like the second mate walking around and filling out the weather log and reporting it back. And I remember doing that as a student, these long weather data collections that then we sent into, I'm guessing, the New Zealand Met Office, or we sort of sent that data in as like a reporting ship, which, in the day-to-day is like you're filling out all these little boxes and inputting in them into the computer. Like, it's not exciting, riveting stuff, even though it is, it's an important part of your day-to-day. And I think, that came out in the book in a way that was interesting, even though you're describing this, a sort of, often describing sort of a normal day in the life.
Yeah, and when you think about where those numbers go, I mean, that's a pretty good example. You think about you're recording data from a ship, and where all that stuff goes when you drop it in the box, and that's this whole, whole world. It's really, this unbelievable system that forecasts weather, and that collecting data is a huge part of that. Even now, I mean, any weather office you walk into, and if you're a mariner, one of the first things they get after you about is how important ship data are, because there's just, for all the tools that we have for collecting data, there's really, surface measurements wind up being one of the most important, or a very important part of the weather forecasting and modeling system. And most of the planet's water, right? Everybody keeps telling us that. And, the only way you can get measurements from the surface is from a ship or a buoy, and there's some buoys out there, but there's a lot of empty ocean. So the ship observation system is still huge. And just the whole system of forecasting, the forecast offices and the modeling and the data handling and, the whole, art and science of creating forecasts. It's just this, really this fascinating world. And there's other books just about that. And then, if you kind of look back, there's this whole, the whole history of meteorology, of, the history of human understanding of weather, both from like the sailing standpoint and the scientific standpoint, are just, sort of equally fascinating. So, I wound up, any one of those probably could have been a book on its own. But, what I wound up was like trying to put all that into one book.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think giving a pretty cool snapshot of the sort of the present moment, but through this lens that, like, I don't know, sailing on a traditional vessel or a sailing ship is like, you're sort of looking back into the past all the time a little bit. We're taking the slower route across the ocean than container ships do, or than you could in the modern age. So we're sort of choosing this slower and more analog method, but you're still getting all of the modern weather data at the same time. So I feel like it gives you like an ability to like look both into the present moment and into the future a little, and also look back. I think you and most sailors like appreciate the analog way. And I think can you talk a little about like how you hold both, like the modern models that you download and the grid files, and then not letting go of the sort of analog methods of weather observation and forecasting that you do on the ship?
Well, I think you're sort of forced into it, particularly if you're working, if you're spending a lot of time outside, right? If either, doing work, if you're fishing or something like that and spending a lot of time out on, out in the weather, or if you're operating a sailing vessel and sort of, pretty much, or even any smaller vessel where, where you get to is really dependent on what the weather is doing. And so you're, you're definitely, you're forced into a direct appreciation of what's going on, at the surface where you are. I think that, again, this is, the smaller, I mean, there, certain ships, large, deep draft commercial ships, for a large part of the time, they can, not always, right? There's some very critical exceptions, but for the most part, they can go about their business and not really be too concerned with what's happening. But, on a lot of smaller vessels, that's not true. And you need to be able to understand, even if you're not sailing, you need to sort of understand where you are on the map. And that's about just, just taking some kind of local measure of what the weather is doing. So you can sort of think about, you develop that sense of anticipation about what's going to be happening.
Yeah, I think you said something that's making me think of a few things that I think you said in the book, but like you need the tools to like read the clouds and read the weather to understand the forecast you're getting. And you like made a, reference to like being in a new city, holding a paper map, and you need to be able to read the street signs or know, you sort of need the fundamentals to understand the forecast. And I think I've been on boats and on trips where you sort of see your people or even yourself getting lost in the forecast and sort of looking at the grid file and zooming into where you are and saying, okay, we're supposed to have 25 knots of wind from this direction according to the forecast, and losing sight of like what's outside and not walking outside and saying, we don't have 25 knots, we have 15 and it's actually from the southwest, and what does that mean? And there are all these very simple like lessons and tools that we can use to understand the weather without, like getting lost in the screen,
Yeah, and the screen is miraculous, and you don't want to leave home without it. But the models that are used to create weather forecasts, I mean, they don't have the grain size to say exactly what's going on, like on every square kilometer of ocean, and even where they might, they still, they don't necessarily perfectly, like, it's almost because of the speed at which everything is moving, they can't achieve a perfect match in real time. And the forecasters will tell you that's why the information from the ships at sea is so important, because they can say, well, the model says the cold front is here, but we just had the ship, we just had this wind report, and they still got wind out of the south. So obviously the cold front hasn't reached that location yet. And that's the sort of stuff that.
You also said something that I think about all the time with seamanship, which is anticipating the unexpected. And that's sort of a contradictory phrase, how do you anticipate something that you can't expect? So often to me, the scariest things in life and at sea are the things you can't expect, or just anticipating the next thing, like worrying about what will happen before it happens. So I guess my first question is sort of how you, I guess sort of what makes you feel the most fear when you're at sea, and how you handle that.
Well, I think, again, sort of the maritime like profession, or, still the maritime occupation is just one of those things that's sort of built around the understanding that you're in an unpredictable environment. So a lot of it is, it gets back to the whole, the idea of, the lookout and things like that. I mean, you're always trying to gather information about your surroundings so that you can, whether you're looking out into the world or whether you're just sort of, the internal version of the lookout, which is like your rounds on the ship, right? You're always just walking around the ship, looking for signs that things have changed, or, so you're always collecting information, just kind of in search of, changing situation.
Yeah.
So I think that's so in that way, it's just sort of recognition that, expecting the unexpected. And that's just kind of that's almost a steady state in its own, I think. Typically, like I'm thinking of the times at sea that I've been most apprehensive, in general have involved, have often involved situations, without getting into too much detail, situations involving the well-being of people, of individuals, rather than the environment.
Yeah. Is there one of those instances that you want to get, or that you would want to get into more detail on? Like, was there one that stood out as like, that stands out to you?
No, I mean, not really in specifics, but just, your book, need to look after a community of people, and you don't necessarily have the resources at sea that you do ashore. And, people are such an important part of the process.
Yeah, we're the most fragile part of it too. Like, I feel like
often.
There we talk about like, there are all sorts of conditions that you can experience at sea, and often the ship can handle it, but it's the question is often, for one of the questions for me is often if the people can handle it, whether that's, uncomfortable conditions or just, like the ship might weather the storm, but if someone goes overboard, then we failed, like then that's the worst case scenario. So
right, exactly.
Yeah.
Or if the people get pushed to the point for one reason or another, they can't look after the ship anymore. So
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious when, if there's like an instance or a moment that you can pinpoint of a time when you learned like how important it is to be able to change the plan.
Oh, pretty much all the time. And that's one of those I think I do, but I do mention that in the book, I think, because it actually, as I did a little bit of reading, discovered, I mean, that's a baked in part of human, I think, that's the way we're wired, really. I think, to one extent or another, just everybody, you get plans. Changing your plan can be very, very difficult. And I mean, sort of come up with an idea and then, I think, I think you get constant reminders of how, I don't think you don't even need to go to sea for this, really. Your day can be full of reminders that, the easiest thing, the hardest thing to do is to change your plan, but in the end, you realize that was the best and easiest way to deal with the situation. So,
Right. Yeah.
I think when you're in a leadership role, I think that, what I feel like has always worked the best for me is to, sort of make sure, like, understand yourself that that's okay, and make sure that the people that you're working with you sort of understand that also, so to not feel like some part of your credibility is connected to sticking with plan A all the time, because in fact that's not. That can be one of the most disconcerting things. Having been on both sides of the process, right, can be one of the most disconcerting things is when you feel like you're in a situation where, you're staying with a plan that, isn't maybe operable anymore.
Yeah. I wonder if you have examples of that, because I'm thinking of examples of that in my own, being sometimes the captain and sometimes not, and as the captain, I feel like it's harder to. I've been in the situation where I know we need to change the plan, but one moment I communicate that, you see the ripple effect through the crew, and I remember my mate getting sort of like, well, we said we were going to sail to the next island today. Why aren't we doing that? And that even though it was the right call to sort of maybe skip this stop because we need to get here before this weather comes, or whatever the instance was.
Right.
Yeah, that was hard for me as a new captain, was to be like, yes, we do need to change the plan, even though it's hurting all of your feelings to have the plan changed. Right. Do you have an example of that?
I'd have to think about, like a specific, I'd have to think pretty hard about what would be the most effective single example. But I think, like what you were saying, I think that one of the things that you maybe don't anticipate, I know, like, still remember, like, starting out, in like captain's jobs, and there's a lot of the process to think about, sort of like specific technical skills that you're concerned about, but the challenge of making plans, changing plans, managing people's expectations, that's sort of one of those hidden jobs, that winds up taking up the most of you, at least for me, takes up a lot of time and energy, thinking about, well, we're going to do this, or if you're going to make a plan, or if you're going to change a plan, how does it affect people, both in terms of how does this change their day, their job, and then also, like, what's the impact of just, what are their expectations, and then how do you manage people's expectations when a plan is changing? Yeah,
that one's hard. I think, and I think it has led me to try to always start, the day or the trip, like making it clear that the plans often change, and even just that like people anticipating that the plans might change, even that is quite hard for people, I've noticed. This was like, it probably is not something that stood out, that would have stood out to you from our trip in New Zealand. And I can't even quite remember where we were, which isn't helpful. But I think there's this memory I have that I think about quite often, and I sometimes tell people that I now sail with. But we were We might have been getting ready to head into Christchurch, actually, towards the end of the passage. And I remember I was at the helm, and we were maybe motor sailing up towards this fjord, and it's just sort of beautiful cliffs in New Zealand, green hills, and it's sort of misty up the fjord. And then as we get closer to the fjord, the mistiness is coming down the fjord, and suddenly you can't see the fjord, and it's actually this wall of wind and rain like rushing down at us. And I remember, you talking to a mate and sort of muttering happening on deck, and then you turned to me, and we struck the sails and we turned downwind and just ran bare poles away from this squall that was coming at us. And the phrase you used was that we were bravely running away. And I remember that sticking out to me then, because I hadn't considered that as an option, that you could bravely run away. Yeah, and I think about it a lot still, and sort of use that example when I'm sailing with people or teaching people that, like, yeah, sometimes that's the best call. There's not, it can feel like you need to like charge into the storm or whatever, but like, and we were making quite good speed. On that ship, bare poles, just like, blasting away.
That does sound like New Zealand.
Yeah. Did you ever have a time where you messed that up, like where you didn't bravely run away, or you didn't change the plan and because you didn't think you needed to or didn't want to, and wished you had?
Oh yeah. I mean, there's lots of times, like I said, in general, I've been fortunate to in the end create an okay outcome. But there's I think anybody and again, probably most people in their lives have all kinds of examples like this. But right, where you sort of force a plan, because you get to the end and you realize, wow, that was, much more, that was much more challenging than it needed to be. Or, here we are, that all worked. But, you wound up realizing you somehow put yourself in a place where, you had, a lot less room for things to go wrong than you'd originally hoped, but you were kind of, feeling confined to a plan.
What tends to force that situation, or what tends to create that situation?
I think probably because you're, maybe there's something, you feel like there's some sort of, other kind of, I think one of the most challenging things is, some sort of logistical imperative, this isn't I didn't make this up, but I heard somewhere, and, it's an expression that I've reused, like in talking to students, is like, what's the most dangerous thing on the ship? And people come up, it's the engine, it's the galley, it's it's climbing the rig, it's like, no, it's the clock, it's the calendar. The sort of need to, whether it's, some kind of an economic reason. Certainly you got a boatload of passengers and they're all expecting you to be there. It's non-trivial to say, well, no, we're actually not going to be there today. We're going to be there tomorrow. I mean, it's not a decision you can take lightly, but it is, and I think that, the situation that you described, it took me a minute but I do, it's a whole series of expectations, right? I think we were finishing a trip and, expecting to be there. We had arrangements with the port and the pilots, and they actually, I don't think they were quite aware, maybe not aware of our capacities as a vessel, and not exactly aware, at least in a minute-to-minute sense, of what the weather was like out at the port entrance. So we all had a plan. They told us to come ahead in, and there we were. And then that, I guess, would have been a situation. We could have continued and tried our luck. In the end, I don't remember. I guess we spend the night. We spend the night offshore and come in the next day.
I think we did. I think we did. Yeah.
But without, like I said, I have to sort of flip through, various trips and think about. But there's certainly been times when we've kind of gone the other way, and maybe that particular day, that day that you were there, may have been, that decision may have been descended from a time where we went through hell to get ourselves someplace on plan. And afterwards realized it wasn't really worth the trouble and
and I think it's that, like, weighing those options, sort of like, is this worth the maybe it's just discomfort more than anything, or the crew getting soaking wet and exhausted, or maybe it is sort of like increasing the risk, or the potential for things to go wrong in making those calls. What do you feel like you learned from writing and publishing this book?
Well, it's sort of, if you do it by the hour, it might be the lowest paying job I've ever had. It was a tremendous amount of fun. It was really something that I sort of went to work on and kind of developed a momentum of its own. So I think that what I really learned was I was incredibly lucky to have some both in terms of like the content of the book, all the stuff, all the people that I got to work with at sea, and collecting information for the book. Certainly it made me aware of how many amazing people that I've gotten to work with and learn from over time. And that was really cool, just to sort of think about, sort of put that all together and really think about that. And then I was also was very lucky, sort of step by step along the way, to find people to kind of help me learn about this completely new world, which is this the process of writing a book and getting it published. And that was I had a few people who I was connected to through sailing who had actually had written books and were able to to offer up a little bit about what the process was like. And I think there's this sort of general view, well, you write something and then, you find a publisher and you send it to them. And then, what happens when you do that is it disappears. You never see it and you never hear anything again. And it turns out like there's this whole sort of intermediate world about, like how stuff gets prepared, and how, the sort of, the world of agents and editors, and just how that, how materials get managed between the people who are doing the writing and the people who are publishing them.
Yeah. Was there anything that really surprised you about that?
Well, I think it was just realizing the level of kind of intermediate steps, and just how many steps of a manuscript, starting with an idea, how many steps a manuscript has to go through before it actually turns into a book.
Yeah.
And all the people that are involved.
Yeah, I'm sure it's not a.
Like I said, was lucky enough to get to work, along the way. I mean, there were, sort of 3 or 4 people who were really instrumental, and it's kind of like exactly like a sailing voyage. You get to the end, it's like, wow, there's no way we could have done that without, the engineer or the chief mate or the cook, or all of them together. So that was,
that's quite cool.
That really was what the writing project was like.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I feel like we didn't talk about the book much because, I want people to read it. And Andy Schell, who founded and owns 59 North Sailing and this podcast that we're talking on, loved, like I gave him the book, and I gave a book to each of the boats that sail with 59 North. So they're in those ships' libraries. But once he read it, he was like, this is the best book on weather I've ever read, and recommended it off to everyone. And it is really, it is a really great book on weather, and it's so engaging, which I think for people who are already weather obsessed, like, they get the added benefit of the stories of your time at sea. But for most people, they get, I felt drawn in by the sea stories, and then was given all these lessons on weather that I feel like, many of which I've heard before from you and from other captains, but also a lot of it was new as well. There was a scene I remember that maybe I want to talk about before we close, which was right at the beginning of the book. I think you're on Bowdoin, or some other wooden schooner, but I think Bowdoin, somewhere north, and you are in this. You're coming into a gale, I think, and the seas are picking up, and you describe seeing a pod of orcas through one of the waves that is up next to the ship. So the ship is going up the peaks and down the troughs, and you're down in a trough, and you see whales through the wall of water. And I have to ask you if that actually happened and what that was like.
Yeah, no, that is completely true story. They were actually pilot whales. They were not orcas, and a pilot whale was, is like one of the larger. I think the orca is the largest member of like the dolphin family, and the pilot whales are close. They're, but mostly they swim at a distance. Usually, they're not that friendly, and they're pretty much all one color. They're very like almost jet black. And so it's kind of hard to get a sense of their size when they're swimming by. But, in this case, right, they were suddenly, I mean, we were just like you described, we were, in a large sea, and we just sort of sank into the trough of a wave and just looking out at the wave right next to the ship. And there they all were. And, I sort of became two things. Was suddenly, acutely aware of how large they were. I mean, they're about, 18 to 20 feet long, a couple of tons, and that they were jumping, directly towards us. And of course, they had a plan. But it was impossible to know that. But that instant, it really did look like they were going to land right on the deck.
Oh my gosh!
So yeah.
I
didn't make that up. I don't know how you could make something like that up, but yeah.
I know, and there are. I mean, was that like, I don't know. I get one of my questions I have written down is what the most, and this is a hard one, but like what the most remarkable thing you've seen at sea was, and I don't know if that was it. That sounds pretty remarkable to me, but I'm sure there were other things that you've seen at sea that feel like maybe they were made up.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess sort of as oh wow moments. That was one. I don't. It's kind of hard to say, and I think probably like, well, you spent a lot of time at sea yourself, so we'll kind of understand that probably some of the most remarkable moments are actually they're not particularly spectacular, but just like I remember being on, it's actually on a voyages described in the book, but it was on a passage, it might be the longest continuous passage I've taken, which was we sailed from the west coast of North America to the Marquesa Islands, and it's about 20, it's just shy of 3,000 miles, and we're just sort of halfway along that passage, and hadn't seen a ship for days. It's not a well-traveled part of the ocean unless you happen to come across somebody who's doing the same sailing passage. And I do remember, and again, this is a moment that I really do recall, is I remember walking out on deck, during an evening, like we were right at the halfway point. I remember because it was like, it was 1,400 miles both ways. And I remember we were sort of joking, but not really, about, you get to the point, something goes wrong. Do you keep going or do you go back? And, but so we had just sort of passed that point that day. And then I remembered walking out on deck that night and just looking up. There was no moon and it was perfectly clear. And I remember looking up at the sky, and the first thing I noticed were the Magellanic Clouds, which are kind of at the tail end of a sort of a series of stars that you can find, in celestial navigation. And you get to the end, you get to the last one, like a Spica and Virgo, and then the next thing you see are just these big fuzzy blobs, and those are the Magellanic Clouds, and they're not actually in our galaxy. They're extragalactic. They're little dwarf, but they're not. They're not in the Milky Way. They're somewhere else. But I just remember walking out and looking up at those, and just like the whole experience. It was like, I felt like I was on a spaceship. I still remember that.
That's cool. I remember seeing those. I must have been in New Zealand. I remember seeing those, I think, on our trip, and you pointing them out. And can you describe what they are again? Are they galaxies, or?
They are, I'm not an astronomer, but I mean, they're dwarf galaxies, so, they're star clusters, like thousands and thousands of stars, but they're outside the Milky Way.
Wow.
Sounds like the Monty Python sketch, or is it where the guy goes, "Oh, beyond nature," but but they are, in terms of things that you can see, just stand there and look at. I think you have to be in the southern hemisphere to see them, but they're the galactic objects that are outside of the Milky Way.
Yeah,
and it was just sort of being aware of that.
Far away.
Yeah. And being there, looking at that, and just sort of being aware of that, and where I was standing, and
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
Go was going to say I spent a lot of time standing around, looking up at the sky from ships, but that's a particular moment that I remember very directly.
That's cool. Yeah, I think it's sort of, I don't know, it's a little cliche maybe, or like typically sort of romantic in the sort of going to sea sense, but I do think really like some of those moments where I remember the first time I walked up on deck at night on the Robert C. Seamans when we were at sea, and we were probably still pretty close to land in New Zealand. We never got that far offshore, but yeah, like seeing the night sky in the southern hemisphere for the first time at sea was a moment I'll remember forever. And I love watching. I think part of what I like about sail training is watching people have those experiences for the first time. Is really neat. Like seeing the night sky at sea for the first time is one that's really cool. Yeah, and sitting on that boat on the Seamans with all these crew members. I remember, you talking about the Magellanic Clouds and Rocky telling us about the constellations and just the vast amount of knowledge stored on those boats, like you were describing, from getting to the windjammers and just realizing how much knowledge is stored among those crews and those ships is pretty spectacular. Yeah, it's really great. Is there anything I didn't ask you about that you've thought of or want to mention before we sort of wrap up?
No, I don't think so. We should say the title of the book, I guess, which is Reading the Glass, and it's very easy to get. It's a Penguin Random House book, so very easy to find. And my publisher and my agent would want me to say that, but for those who don't know it, yeah. But otherwise, say again, like the most satisfying part of that project really was getting to reflect on all the tremendous, amazing people that I've gotten to work with and learn from myself over the years. Just wrap up. I think it's great. It's great to catch up with you as an old shipmate and to have the chance to talk.
Thanks again to Dive Blue for presenting this season of On the Wind. Go to diveblue.com. That's DIVEBLU 3.com to check it out. Thanks to Pelagic Autopilots for sponsoring this episode of the show. To learn more and spec your own system, go to pelagicautopilots.com. On the Wind is the podcast about sailing, created by 59 Degrees North and hosted by me, Emma Garshagen, August Sandberg, and Andy Schell. The show is mixed and produced in Maryland by Lee Cumberland. Episode artwork and website show notes are done by Laura Parent in San Francisco. The intro theme music was written and performed by former podcast guest Cameron Dale. And the outro music that you're hearing now is by our friends at Storm Weather Shanty Choir, who have also been on the show. We love hearing from you, so please send us a note at holdfast@59-north.com. And you can also help us out a lot by reviewing the show on iTunes. It really does help. Thank you so much for listening, and as always, hold fast.
And when me money was all gone on liquor and the horse, I made up me mind that I was inclined to go to sea no more. No more, no more, to go to sea no more. I made up me mind that I was inclined to go to sea no more. As I was walking down the street, I met sweet Angeline. She said, "Come home with me, me lad, and we'll have a cracking time." But when I awoke, it was no joke. I found I was all alone. My silver watch and my money too, and my whole bloody gear was gone. was gone, was gone. My whole bloody gear was gone. It was when I awoke, it was no joke, for my whole bloody gear was gone. As I was walking down the street, I met Big Rapper Brown. I asked him if he would take me in, and he looked at me with a frown. He said,
last time you was paid up with me, you took up no score. But I'll take your advance and I'll give you a chance to go to sea once more.
once more, once more, to go to sea once more. I'll take your advance and I'll give you a chance to go to sea once more. Sometimes we're catching whales, me lads, but mostly we get none. With a 20-foot oar in every paw from 5 o'clock in the morn. And when daylight's gone and the night's coming on, we rest upon our oars. And oh boys, you wish that you was dead or snug with the girls ashore. Ashore, ashore, or snug with the girls ashore. Oh boys, you wish that you was dead or snug with the girls ashore. Come all you seafaring lads that listen to me song. When you go a big boating, boys, make sure you do not go wrong. You take my tip when you come off a trip, don't go with any whores. But get married instead and have all night in bed and go to sea no more. No more, no more, to go to sea no more. Get married instead and have all night in bed and go to sea no more. No more, no more, to go to sea no more. Get married instead and have all night in bed and go to sea no more.